Hey everyone, I'm Bryce, and you're watching Bryce About Music. And today we're going to be doing something different than in our last few videos, as we just took a look at the top 10 albums of 2008 from a modern perspective in a countdown in our last video. I'll have a link to that in the description in case you haven't watched it yet. And as it so happens, I made a list back in 2008 of my favorite 10 albums from that year. I was a huge music fan back then as well. I had a music blog and I pulled up my own music blog. I don't know what's on here, but we're going to find out together, and I'm going to see what I listened to back then and what I thought were the top 10 albums of the year back in 2008. So as you can see here at number 10, we have Dig Lazarus Dig from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. That's a solid album. I'm a little surprised to see it on this list, however, as it's, well, one of the better modern Nick Cave albums. I wouldn't necessarily consider it to be a great overall album. I really like the title track. I really like More News from Nowhere, but it's not an album I've necessarily gone back to a whole lot. So kind of interesting to see that on there at number 10. I actually remember Nick Cave's Grinder Man projects, a little bit more of a grittier, more noise rock feel from this era than I do Dig Lazarus Dig. And we'll move now to number 9, and this is one that I definitely remember, or at least this style I definitely remember. Gojira, The Way of All Flesh. I actually considered this album for the list that we just put out, and ended up not making the cut simply because it didn't quite match up to From Mars to Sirius, which I think is the strongest Gojira album. That's, if I'm going to recommend an album from Gojira, that's the one that I would, and that's the one I go to. But this is one of many very good metal albums from this year, and I imagine it's not going to be the only metal album that we'll see. This one mixes progressive metal, death metal, thrash metal. It's a solid album, but just not one that I would necessarily put on a top 10 list anymore. And we move to number 8, Fleet Foxes. I did have Fleet Foxes on our list. We had it at number 6, and so it's moved up a couple of spaces. I did really like this album when it came out. I remember actually seeing this band at Sasquatch Festival. They're from my neck of the woods here in the Pacific Northwest, and I remember them playing the first set of the night at Sasquatch, or of the afternoon actually, and then when the National couldn't make it last minute, Fleet Foxes came back that same day and did another set, and they were kind of the butt of jokes in our friend group, even though their set was good, but just they kind of popped up all over the place playing the same set. And then their album came out, and nope, no more jokes. I talk about this album on our countdown again at number 6, and you can go hear that there. It's a great album, still a great album. Highly recommend it. At number seven, excuse me, this was a bit of a surprise. Ihsahn, Angel. Ihsahn's the front man of Emperor, one of my favorite metal bands of all time, legendary black metal band. And this is an album I'm not sure that I've necessarily heard since it first came out. I should also preface this by saying I have not really looked at this list at all, so this is a bit of a surprise to see it. I think I just really liked that this album was the return of Ihsahn, being a huge Emperor fan at the time. Again, it's a good album, and Ihsahn has put out solid albums since then as he's continued his solo career, but it's not one that I would necessarily go back to as like a classic or an amazing album. It's a solid work of prog metal, but I do kind of remember my 17-year-old self being very, very into this, and then not really touching it a whole lot after that. But Ihsahn's an awesome artist regardless. And at number 6, Sadistic, The Balancing Act. This is another one that I considered for the list. Sadistic is a rapper from here in Seattle, and he has a very ethereal, very dreamy style. He raps over production from Emancipator and A Kid Called Computer on this album. And the reason I ultimately didn't put it on the list we did is because in comparison to something like I Have a Nice Life, which relishes in the same type of depressive themes, Sadistic is maybe a little bit more cookie cutter, a little bit more generic in terms of some of the imagery he's using. But this is still an excellent album, and if you like more dreamy, ethereal beats and kind of the depressive side of hip hop, 100% check this out, and check out Sadistic in general. I'm actually, I didn't know he'd be on this list, kind of had a feeling, but didn't think about it. I'm actually wearing a Sadistic shirt here, so shout out to Sadistic. An interesting, very unique rapper. Was compared to Slug from Atmosphere a little bit when he came out, but stylistically, I don't think he really has a ton in common. It's just the voice. Number 5, Stay Positive by The Hold Steady. This is probably the album I've fallen off of the most out of any on this list. I would guess I kind of have a feeling of what the next 4 are going to be based on what I remember listening to when I was 17. And this is a bar rock album. Interesting lyrics, interesting storytelling. But yeah, The Hold Steady kind of don't do as much for me anymore. They're just like, their sound is cool, but I like the storytelling, but they don't change enough from album to album. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, you should check out Stay Positive over Boys and Girls in America or really any other Hold Steady album. Number 4, Insurgentes by Steven Wilson. Steven Wilson, of course, the frontman of Porcupine Tree, an excellent progressive rock band, one of my favorite bands when I was 17. And this was his first solo album, and I remember really loving this album. And in going back to it, I still think it might be the best or second best solo album of his. Hand Cannot Erase, I think, is actually the best. But what kind of brings it down a little bit for me now is how much of the King Crimson and retro progressive worship has been going on in progressive rock since then. And so I don't have quite as much tolerance for that style. And at this point, Steven Wilson was definitely starting to go into the more retro 60s and 70s sounding progressive rock. But again, a solid album, and I think actually a little bit more experimental even than the 2 records that he did after that, which are a little bit more tied to that era of progressive rock. I like the opening song, Harmony Korine, quite a bit. At number 3, we have this on the list, Atmosphere, When Life Gives You Lemons, You Paint That Shit Gold. Still love this album. Again, number 3, very, very high. This was definitely the kind of hip-hop that I loved back then. And, I mean, I still do, 100%. With a lot of different kinds of hip-hop. But When Life Gives You Lemons was an album that really resonated with me back when it came out. I still think it holds up really well. Again, maybe not quite to 3rd album of the year or the 3rd best album of the year, as underground hip-hop has evolved quite a bit in that time. But other than God Loves Ugly, my favorite Atmosphere record, and an album that I was blown away with when it came out. Love the storytelling on it. Again, you can hear me talk about that one more in depth on our video. At number 2 here, Watershed from Opeth. That's an interesting one because I went back and listened to this in preparation for the video, and I was a little bit disappointed by... I wanted to like it more than I did. I still like it, still a great album, no doubt about that, but it didn't end up making it because it really signaled the turn from Opeth from what they were, a progressive death metal band, into what they are now, which is the most boring progressive rock or generic 70s style progressive rock band. They sound like any sort of King Crimson clone, and I don't like any of the music they're doing now at all. And this has a little bit too many of the tropes of that. At the time, loved it. It signaled them going more into that direction, but still had a lot of the heaviness, even if it didn't have quite the amount of growling. But yeah, from today's perspective, it's still good, but didn't quite do it for me as much. Didn't end up making the list. And at number 1 here, TV on the Radio, Dear Science. Still ended up at number 1. So there you go. Loved it when it came out. Still love it now. So that's the list. Thanks so much for watching. Nothing really too embarrassing in there. I'm pretty happy with my 17-year-old self back in high school. So thanks again. We'll have more videos coming soon. Countdown Best of 1978 coming soon. See ya.